All right, let's go ahead and get started. So let's start by setting our motivation. So take a moment to reflect on the thoughts, the interest that brought you here this evening. And then try to broaden, expand that motivation. Try to intentionally set a motivation where you are widening your circle of concern as broadly as you can. And think that the purpose of your time is to find ideas and tools that can be used to increase your ability to benefit sentient beings. Try to think about your participation through that lens. Trying to include the greatest number of sentient beings that you can. All right. So before we move on, as I do, were there any for people who were here last week? I don't know if everybody was here last week. We are at the end of our series. For this particular series, we do this every other month. This series. But anyone who was here, did they have a question about what we covered?
Right. Yeah, I just have that outstanding question with regards to the concept of teacher-student or / guru situation. So I think you're going to talk more about that anyway today. Am I correct?
Yeah, yes, and it's going to be difficult to finish. I don't think we're going to finish the overall material. What I may have to do is just record additional material and put it on the YouTube channel. And then perhaps next week, if people are here, we could, after class or something, maybe discuss a little bit, because there's a great deal of material that's not covered. And
Sure.
that's relevant in the sense that particular topic is just an extraordinarily complex topic. There is a whole module in Discovering Buddhism on properly relating to the spiritual guide. We do have a version of that on the YouTube channel, so you can look for that. We did that just this past year. That will give you a lot more detail. Of course, if you have a specific question, we can look at that. But the other one thing, in addition to what was said last week, the other one specific thing that I wanted to mention is that when we study this material, because of the kind of primacy, because you can see right in the right in the verse, it says that this is the root, correct devotion to one's teacher is the root of the path. And so that kind of sentiment, which we find expressed throughout Buddhism and maybe Tibetan Buddhism really emphasizes that, can give a person, particularly a newer student, sort of the impression that, if I don't have some sort of special, relationship with someone who's extraordinarily accomplished, and they live right next to me, and I can go over to their house, 3 or 4 times a week, then everything is lost. And that's something that I want to really caution people against thinking, because very few, in the West, it's quite difficult to have the kind of relationship that is espoused in historical Buddhism, when there were, gurus in every, temples in every town, and, a whole culture devoted to the raising of teachers and so on. So
I
would
think
say,
the other challenge for the Westerners is, and I know even within Buddhism, there have been people who have so grossly abused that relationship. So particularly, and I've not been directly in one, but very closely connected. So I have a real emotional response. And particularly when you talk about having somebody in, real time, like I can understand acknowledging Buddha, Tara easily, but to have somebody in, present day that I can't be sure is reliable, that's where I get all uncomfortable. And I would not be the only one, because I go to things and I hear lots, not only my situation.
Yeah. So certainly that's a major issue, particularly, maybe more so in the West, because the East is kind of a more cooperative, communal sort of culture, and the West is more individualistic, and so maybe there's the idea of coming under training, the idea of being guided, the idea of submitting in a way to training, is a much more foreign kind of concept to the Western sort of psyche. And as you're saying, and as I mentioned last week, the people, many of the people that have been harmed, that didn't necessarily have a lot of really clear red flags. So this, where, of course, when we say the importance of checking, the importance of, understanding the qualifications of the teacher, and also just making sure, because a teacher can be completely qualified, but that doesn't make them suitable to be one particular person's root teacher. Their approach might not be suitable for that person's mind, irrespective of how objectively qualified they may be. That doesn't make them suitable to be a specific person's teacher. So there's also a checking in terms of the fit between the two people, in terms of disposition, personality, because teachers take different approaches. Some teachers are more strict, some are more, outwardly patient, and because they're trying to tame people in different ways, to try to ripen people's minds in different ways. So we have to find the kind of teacher that appeals to us and is appropriate for our own personal disposition. But yeah, of course, there is no magic solution or magic bullet that will prevent a person, 100% from ever entering into a relationship where they made a mistake about, unbeknownst to them, they didn't fully understand, or they didn't have all of the information, or the information was too hidden for them to be able to make the right decision. And that is, of course, always in a way a danger. So all we can do, that there is no like formula that just prevents that. The best formula that we have is to rely on the highest possible teachers, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, the highest possible teachers, and then look at who are their students, what experiences do people have, and like I said, just do a long, try to really go slowly and do a long process of checking. But yeah, it's always a concern and it's always a danger, and that's just unfortunately the nature of things. So yeah, I wish that I could say that there was some method or some process that made it completely safe, and there just isn't. It's just that we do have to do a lot of careful examination, a lot of careful checking, talking to that, other students that person has, other lamas that have been the teacher of that person, their reputation in terms of what roles they've had. And still, of course, no matter what, there's no completely foolproof process. The kind of psychological benefit, though, of proper reliance is that it benefits this idea of seeing the guru as Buddha, and having correct, proper, reliance. Is the psychological underpinning of that is that it benefits oneself, provided that one's teacher is a reliable guide. Having that kind of approach is an approach where it allows the disciple to actually make the most rapid progress, because the way that you hear the advice of the teacher and the way that you implement the advice of the teacher is different than if you just think of that person as, a learned scholar. If you see that person as inseparable from the Buddha, then your own pathway to enlightenment is much more rapid. But when it goes poorly, there's an incredible harm that can happen.
Thank you. Okay, so in a way, this next slide is sort of philosophically the beginning of the lamrim, in a way, because we said that proper reliance kind of is the foundation of the lamrim, and then in terms of philosophically the actual and training in proper reliance, of course, is part of the lamrim, but in terms of kind of the philosophy as it relates to reality, the philosophy as it relates to the way things are, this is kind of the beginning of that, where this idea of the precious human rebirth is introduced, the freedoms and the endowments of a precious human rebirth. So we'll unpack kind of the meaning of this quote. There's different parts here. So when we say precious human rebirth or perfect human rebirth, it is true that we are distinguishing this from just human rebirth. This is a particular type of human rebirth where we would have to say that not all human beings have what's called a precious or perfect human rebirth. This is a human rebirth that is qualified by the freedoms and the endowments. When we say freedom, we mean freedom from something that is negative, being free from a condition that would be an obstacle to spiritual progress. So
the first four of these freedoms are other realms of existence. So this does characterize all human rebirth. All human beings are, by definition, not presently experiencing a rebirth in the hell realm, the spirit realm, the animal realm, or the celestial realm. Celestial is the word that I'm using to refer to the upper realm in the desire realm, or even the form or formless realms. So the upper realm rebirths. So we are free from, presently in this lifetime, we are free from those types of rebirths. And that's beneficial for two different reasons. The lower realms prevent practice because the suffering in the lower realms is too great to actually practice. And then the enjoyment of the upper realm is too great to practice. The beings in the upper realm are too distracted by the general enjoyments that can occur in those realms, and they see no reason to practice. They don't have overt suffering. They don't see overt suffering, and so why would they want to escape? Why would they want to do anything other than just have more of that? Whereas we do ourselves suffer, and we do see suffering, and that can motivate practice. So quite good that we are not experiencing the kind of baked in disadvantages of these other realms. And then there are some sort of conditional or outward other factors where we are presently free from living in a time and place where the Buddha has not taught. That's certainly possible. We could have our lives could be identical essentially, except for the world that we are born in. No Buddha has ever given the teachings, but we are free from that. And then going along with that, a Buddha could have given the teachings, but it could be perhaps, so many thousands of years ago that those teachings have been lost completely. And we're also free from that in this particular incarnation. Those teachings exist in their complete form, and they're still practiced and understood widely. So those are kind of external environmental factors. And then there are two internal factors, personal factors that relate to the body and mind. The first is, I would say, to a large degree, kind of a cultural statement that these teachings arose thousands of years ago, and when people had what's called defective sense powers, meaning blindness or deafness or some other kind of sensory deficit, then it was a much bigger deal, of course, than it is now. We have technology and different sorts of things that can ameliorate many of those obstacles. But when this teaching arose, of course, that wasn't true, and so it was a much stronger obstacle. You could say perhaps that not being able to get imprints, karmic imprints through the eyes and the ears, that there's some impact to that in terms of mantra recitation, in terms of certain practices. Perhaps there's still some impact, but I do think that a lot of this has been ameliorated by technology in more modern times. And then wrong views is that's something that's a little bit more interesting in the sense that wrong views is kind of a broad category. And we kind of have to think, well, do I have wrong views or not? So because this assumes that a perfect or precious human rebirth is a person that's characterized by being free from wrong views. But a wrong view could be something like, not just completely denying even the possibility of past and future lives or karma or enlightenment. It isn't to say that being skeptical or questioning or not understanding or not being sure is a wrong view, but being kind of dismissive, being closed-minded, being kind of unwilling to think about or even approach the subject, or just being totally closed off to the idea. That, from the Buddhist perspective, that's a wrong view. So really clinging very tightly to being certain, having a real certainty that there definitely are no past or future lives, or that karma is definitely not a real thing. That's a wrong view. So it's the tightness, the kind of inflexibility of the mind with regard to these things. So it's not a skeptical or questioning attitude, which is very helpful, but it's a complete closing off of investigating. Any questions about the freedoms, the negative, or the obstacles that we are free from? So then we have the endowments, or sometimes translated the richnesses. And these are positive things that do characterize our experience in this life. And many of these are kind of the opposite of the negative things. Sorry. So sorry, I went backwards. Okay, so the 5 circumstantial endowments. So again, these are just the opposite of a lot of the negative things. So a Buddha, it's true that a Buddha has come. It's true that a Buddha has taught. It's true that the teachings still exist. There are still people who follow the teachings, and there are here what are called favorable conditions for practice, which means that there are places of study. It means that sincere practitioners can get some support, in our world to practice. So there are still favorable conditions. It's not looked down upon, widely. It's not denigrated widely. So those are circumstantial because they refer to the environment. And then there are personal endowments. So again, just having been born human, so that refers to the opposite of the other realms. And then here, what's called a central land means a place where Buddhism has migrated to, is understood, is practiced, is not kind of outlawed, and then intact sense faculties. And then here, not having committed the 5 heinous actions. So not having killed one's mother, not having killed one's father, not having committed a schism, not drawing, destroying a monastic community, not drawing the blood of a Buddha. So these 5 things that if the understanding is that if a person does one of the 5 heinous actions, then it's very, very difficult to purify. And so as long as we haven't done that, as long as we haven't, killed our parents, or, then we're haven't committed. And so our next life isn't going to be stained by these very, very difficult to purify negative actions. And then having confidence in the teachings. And again, sort of like wrong views, this is something that we have to think about. Like, this is the opposite of wrong views, is having some faith, having some confidence in, that maybe karma is a real thing. Maybe there are past and future lives. So to whatever degree we have some confidence in the teachings, then that's really helpful. Buddhism would say necessary to making progress. Faith is one of the factors, that really allow for progress. Any thoughts or questions on the endowments? Okay. So that's precious human rebirth. And you literally meditate on these freedoms and these richnesses to demonstrate to yourself that you yourself possess a perfect human rebirth, a precious human rebirth. Those two words are quite different in English, but they're used kind of interchangeably in the translation. Precious and perfect seem different to me, but they refer to the same thing. So it's important that we understand that we have not just something to take for granted, but that we have something really precious, really important, really meaningful. But then, after we do that, comes the next philosophical topic of impermanence and death. So we convince ourselves by meditating and understanding and studying perfect human rebirth that we ourselves are in possession of this thing of incredible value. And then we have to study and meditate and convince ourselves that this thing of incredible value that we possess isn't something that we will possess forever, that it is changing moment by moment, and it will also end. It will end this particular incarnation where the causes and the conditions have come together to give us a perfect human rebirth. Those causes and conditions will cease at death. And perhaps, we can create the causes and the conditions again in the future, but it's not automatic. It's not something that just happens. We have to actually create those causes and those conditions. Yeah. So then, on the basis of that, because we introduced karma, also the last verse also introduces the idea of karma, not only impermanence and death, but then at the time of death, of course, karma is ripening all of the time, but the most consequential period of karmic ripening is during the death time and right after the death time in the intermediate state, because the karma that ripens during that time is what will establish an entire rebirth. The karma that ripens in this lifetime doesn't do that. This rebirth is already existent. So the kinds of karma that ripen are ripening within the confines of a human rebirth. But during the death time and at death and in the bardo, that's when things are uncertain. Things are not yet established. So it's quite much more consequential what kind of karma ripens at that time.
Does black and white mean good and bad, or is it just kind of?
It's a poetic way of saying constructive and destructive, or positive and negative. And again, that refers to not a moralistic idea, but the Buddha's direct experience that certain energies bring results that take us away from spiritual progress and spiritual evolution, and some energies bring us closer to that. And so the actions that are motivated by those energies, they're just referred to, conventionally speaking, as positive, negative, constructive, destructive, virtuous, non-virtuous, and black and white is just a poetic way of saying that.
Thank you.
So then when we introduce this idea of karma, the next aspect of what we're trying to do is develop, as it says here, definite conviction in the law of causality, the law of karma. And on the basis of that definite conviction, to really guard our karma, to really, as it says here, avoid even the slightest of negativities and accomplish all virtuous deeds. So taking every opportunity day by day, moment by moment, to watch the mind and guard our karma, to avoid even small negativities, but then also even small positive actions. We shouldn't pass up the opportunity to engage in even small, what seem like, inconsequential or small positive actions, which is done on the basis of understanding that, again, the energies that motivate our actions lead to results that tend to either bring us closer to or take us away from spiritual progress, from tapping into our potential, developing our mind in a positive direction. So the next section is where we'll go into more detail on the law of karma, the law of cause and effect. So we talked a bit about this before, the 4 factors of a complete karma. So there's complete karma and incomplete karma, and then there's throwing karma and completing karma. So we'll talk about these 4 things. A complete karma is more powerful than an incomplete karma. They both exist, they both have power, they both can bring a result, but a complete karma is more powerful than an incomplete karma. The main distinguishing factor between the two is that at the time of death, it's only a complete karma that can ripen, that has the power to ripen as a rebirth. Any incomplete karma, although it could be either positive or negative, if one of these factors is missing, then it will bring some result, but it doesn't rise to the level of what can establish an actual rebirth at the time of death. So what happened? Oh, that's what happened. Sorry. Yeah, so the first factor is what's called the basis. And here, this is the generally sentient being that we're in relationship to through our action. So, for example, if it's an example of a negative karma, then the basis might be the cockroach that we observe in front of us, that's in our space. And then on the basis of observing, or if it's a positive karma, could be someone that we observe who's in some distress that we want to help. So in either case, there's some sentient being in front of us that we are observing, and they are the basis of our action. On the basis of observing, well, when we observe the basis, when we observe that other sentient being, we develop some intention to act in a certain way. We develop the wish to benefit the person who we think needs help, or we might develop the intention to kill the cockroach that we think is invading our space. And then we, on the basis of that intention or motivation, we engage in some act, some sort of outward behavior. We say something, we do something, we maybe even just think something, but we engage in an overt action of body, speech, or mind. And then there's a completion to this chain of events. And that that completion is where the action that we engaged in brings about the intended result. So we saw the cockroach. We said, I don't like cockroaches. We said, my dislike for them is so intense, I'm not going to try to take it outside. I'm going to try to smash it. And then our hand goes out and we smash it, and then we observe that it has died. If it scurries away, if we miss and it scurries away and it's just gone now, then, and maybe we give up, or, we go do something else. We don't kind of like keep hunting for it and pursuing it and then kill it. Then it would be an incomplete karma. We had the basis intact, we had the intention intact, we had the act intact, but it wasn't completed. We failed to do what we wanted to do. So it's still a negative karma. We had a lot of the factors, and perhaps only because of luck, we didn't complete the action. So it's still a negative action, but it's not a completed negative action. In the same way, if we wanted to benefit someone, but they get in their car, before we cross the street, or we lose them in a crowd, again, we had the basis intact, the intention. We were trying to get the money out, or we were getting our phone out to call someone to help them, but then we couldn't actually do it because they were gone. So again, it's still a quite positive karma in that sense, but we weren't actually to bring about the intended act, and so it's an incomplete positive action. So we have to have all four of these factors if we're talking about a complete karma. Otherwise, it's still a karma, it's still a karmic action, just not a completed karmic action, which again only means that it can't establish a rebirth. It can do lots of other things that can be really good or really not so good. Just can't do that one thing. Any questions so far? Okay, so then a complete karma, so I said there were kind of four types of karma. A complete karma can be a throwing karma. I mentioned throwing karma. Throwing karma is the kind of karma that ripens at the time of death that establishes a rebirth. That's a throwing karma, because it's literally throwing you into, under the power of that karma, you're kind of thrown into that next incarnation. A incomplete, I always find this a little funny, an incomplete karma cannot be a throwing karma, but it can be a completing karma, which I just think is strange verbally. An incomplete karma is a completing karma. A completing karma is a karma that ripens within a given lifetime and kind of fills out the details of that lifetime. So it can ripen as like resources, or a lack of resources, or a very healthy state, or a more disease state, or all kinds of different completing the things that fill out what happens in a lifetime, in an incarnation. A complete karma can also do that. A complete karma can also fill in the details, can also ripen in that way, but it can ripen as a throwing karma, whereas an incomplete karma can never ripen as a throwing karma. But an incomplete karma can ripen as a completing karma, which is a weird sentence, but is true. Okay. Still any questions? So now we've talked about the ethical teachings previously when we talked about the lay vows, and then I mentioned that the lay vows are lay vows because they are coarser actions where it's reasonable for a person to say, I'll avoid doing this forever. But that there are also subtler karmas that the Buddha talks about, but they're subtler, and so they're not suitable to say, well, I'll never do it. And that's so now we'll talk about the more general ethical guidelines that the Buddha gave. And some of these are found in the 5 lay vows. Some of them are not, some of them are. So these are all things that we've talked about before. So we don't need to go over these again. These are all, not only are they lay vows, but they're also just broadly, even if a person doesn't take lay vows, the Buddha still identifies these as important. Whereas, for example, like if a person takes one-day vows, if a lay person takes one-day vows, like on a holy day, then they take a vow not to eat past noon. And that's not an ethical teaching of the Buddha. Like that's not there's what are called naturally negative actions, and then there are proscribed negative actions, which means that just because you agreed to do it, it becomes important for you not to do it because you've said that you wouldn't do it. It's kind of, it's a reflection of your own seriousness about how you relate to your practice. So once you agree, I won't eat afternoon today because I'm going to devote today to study and reflection, and I'm going to kind of maybe undergo some hardship to develop some inner resilience, and I see the benefit of that. Then if you just completely ignore what you said, and then it becomes a negative action, but only because you voluntarily agreed. Whereas a naturally negative action is just naturally negative regardless of what a person has said or believes. So killing is bad for all humans regardless. It maybe gets worse once you've taken the vow not to kill, and then you also ignore your own vow that you've voluntarily taken. That makes it perhaps worse. But even for a person who has no vow, when they kill, under the influence of a disturbing emotion, which is generally when people kill, then it creates a karma that will ripen as a suffering experience. And that's true of stealing and sexual misconduct. So those are ethical guidelines for the body, because we kill with our body, we commit sexual misconduct with our body, and we steal. I think, I always kind of say now we might be able to steal with our speech. You might be able to, give commands to a computer that could take money out of someone's account only using your speech. Like that's so here when they mean body in terms of stealing, they mean like literally taking something with your hands, like removing property from someone. That's why it's considered a non-virtue of the body. Maybe it's sort of a little bit different with technology now. Maybe we have to think about it as being different. And at some point, we'll be able to do some of these just with our mind. We'll be able to, think something, and the internet will be able to do something, and it'll change again. But here they say body because they are talking about physically appropriating property. Okay, so then there's ethical guidelines for our speech. And again, we talked about lying, and lying is considered a coarser action that we can abstain from forever. These other 3 are subtler, which the Buddha is saying here we ought to try, we ought to make a genuine effort to avoid these things, but they're not lay vows. So divisive speech, harsh speech, and idle speech. Divisive speech is when we try to break people apart, when we try to sow division or discord between people. So here it doesn't matter if what we're saying is true or not. It doesn't have to be a lie. We can say something that's true, but if our goal is to create disharmony, discord, disagreement, division, then it's divisive speech. And we should, that shouldn't be our motivation. We may say something that a person doesn't want to hear, but our motivation shouldn't be, well, I don't like this other person and I want to separate these people. Our goal should be compassion and taking care of people, and not the goal of just sowing division. Harsh speech, again, is angry speech, is shouting, aggressive, could be, or it could just be any kind of intentional wounding with our speech. Could be said very gently, could be whispered, but if it's meant to push a person's button, to wound them in some way, then it would be harsh speech. And then idle speech, in a technical way, in terms of the historical material, really is to talk about anything that's not related to the teachings. And that has a lot to do with the fact that most of the historical material was written by monks for other monks. So we kind of have to deal with that part of it. And so holding it in that really, really strict way is impossible. But it is important to think about how meaningful is our speech on a general day-to-day basis. Like, do we gossip? Do we talk behind other people's back? Do we spend a lot of time talking about topics and things that are just sort of like popular culture? They don't really mean anything. They're just kind of wasting our time. They're wasting the other person's time. They have no real depth or meaning or significance. And what they say is that one, in one way of thinking, it's the lightest non-virtue of the speech, because it doesn't, no one's really directly harmed by it. But at the same time, of the non-virtues of the speech, we do this one all the time. This is what, Venerable Verbena calls this rabbiting on about nothing, just kind of like talking about what's happening in the weather and who this person is dating or not dating. That's the kind of thing that we just kind of fill empty space with, in conversation. So it's important to think about, am I really meaningfully using my speech, or am I using it to just kind of, other people maybe expect a certain level of banter or small talk, and that's fine. But we just have to kind of think about how pervasive it is. Any questions about the ethical guidelines for this speech? So then, ethical guidelines for the mind, I mentioned that you can create karma. I mentioned the three doors: the body, the speech, and now the mind. So we can create a fully completed karma without actually saying anything or touching anything, without using our body and speech, something that's purely mental. So here the three are covetousness, ill will, and wrong views. So covetousness refers to kind of making designs on other people's property, kind of trying to hint or intimate that you would like someone to buy you something or do something for you, or give you something of theirs that they already own. It's kind of a hoarding, greedy mind. And we can, as I said, we can actually implement it through body or speech, but even when it's just kind of percolating there in the background, that is what will allow it to come out through the body or the speech. So we really want to think about it like, even when it's just kind of there in the mind, when we see the thing and we start to think, I wonder, can I get this person to get this for me or do this. We haven't said anything yet. We haven't, but we probably will if we keep reinforcing that what's happening mentally. We probably will actually try to get that thing if we keep indulging in the mind of covetousness. And then ill will is sort of that same background intention that motivates harsh speech, motivates, all kinds of, it's just wishing ill. It's literally, in some way, it could be actually hoping that something bad happens to someone, feeling like someone deserves to have something bad happen to them. Or it could just be like feeling a sense of delight or glee when we hear that something bad has happened to someone that we think. So, this doesn't mean that we, key someone's car or pop someone's tire or, put salt in their coffee. But it does mean that that if we hear that happens, then like we're fine with it and we think that that's good. Or we even just kind of engage in daydreams or kind of fantasies that we may never act on, but we're creating a tendency in the mind, we're creating a habit in the mind that's making it more and more likely that we are, maybe not in this life, but maybe in a future life, when the causes and the conditions that have created our sense of morality, or propriety, maybe those causes and conditions are looser. And then this habit that we've fomented in this life might actually kind of burst onto the scene, and we really might start acting in more and more harmful ways. And then, as I mentioned, wrong views are kind of that closed-mindedness about the teachings, really just refusing to investigate, just deciding that the teachings are not true. Okay.
I do have a question, if I may.
Yeah.
Yeah. With these things, which some of them I find very difficult to address within myself, their habits established already. At some point, will you talk about techniques to deal with that? Because it's like an automatic response, right? Somebody bothers me, and when a bad thing happens to them, I feel positively about it. Yeah? Mm-hmm. So I try, I'm aware I don't want to be that way, but I'm not quite sure. It seems to be so automatic. I'm not quite sure how to address that.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways. There's many different antidotes, different approaches that we can take. One is to, and a lot of these are very similar to how we get familiar with or do anything. They're in terms of cultivating opposing points of view, or kind of the same way that kind of the same sort of cognitive psychology that we would use for many other sorts of things. So one is to see the disadvantages of that way of, because if we don't, again, like I said, we might think, well, it's harmless. I'm not actually doing anything to the person. I would never actually, swap out their coffee for, muddy water or something. I'm not that kind of person, but it's just sort of a guilty pleasure to think about it. And Buddhism would say that we're kind of mistaken about not understanding that it is actually harmful. Again, even if it's not going to ripen in this life, that tendency could ripen in a future life. So the more that we can see that it is something, the more that we can clearly see this is what I should adopt and this is what I should reject, based on logic, based on reasoning, then the more likely we are to actually change our behavior. Another approach is to recognize, to try to think about, why is it that I dislike this person? Why is it that I think that they are a suitable person to be experiencing hardship, or mistreatment or difficulty? And then when we kind of get clear on, why we think of one person one way and another person another way, then we can start to argue against that foundation. Like, is it why, we would probably come to see that this person that we are fine with being harmed in maybe a light way, what have you, we see them as someone who acts against our own interests in our opinion, or they hold views that we find to be harmful to ourselves or to others. We find that they act in ways that we find, unacceptable. And then when people that aren't like that when they are harmed, we respond with kindness and compassion. Those are the people who have similar views to us, people who have acted in the past to do things that we find beneficial and useful, people that we think are acting in the world in beneficial ways. And so we can see how these two perspectives come down to a very, 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 very egocentric view that, if that person has acted against our interests or the interests of our loved ones, then we're more hostile to them. We don't care so much if they act against the interests of just random people that we don't know. But when it's directed at us, we respond very intensely, with a reaction. So there are ways of overcoming that egocentric view by recognizing that it's illogical, by recognizing that it has no valid basis, that the person that we respond spontaneously with kindness toward, and the person that we respond spontaneously with, hostility toward, they're the same in their basic humanity and their basic status as a suffering sentient being. And discriminating against one or the other principally because of their relationship with really one other sentient being on earth, one other sentient being in the whole of reality, is irrational. And so we can try to argue against how silly the egocentric mind is. And then we can also try to, even if we have to go to like past lives, we can think about, if we accept, the idea of past lives, we can think, well, this person hasn't always had this kind of relationship to me. They've had many other roles, many other kinds of relationships to me. And when they acted kindly toward me, even if I have to go to past lives to find those examples, they were acting from a place of virtue, from a place that is in line with their kind of deeper truth, their more true self. Whereas now in this life, they are acting from a place of the afflicted states. They're acting from a more surface level part of their mind. And so it's really the afflicted state that I should be averse to, and not this person who's just sort of temporarily under the influence of this afflicted state. So we try to separate the action from the underlying humanity or shared sentient experience of the person that we're having trouble with. And again, trying to recollect those kindnesses will make it more likely that is what will arise in our mind when we see them, when we interact with them, rather than litany of past transgressions that are kind of what is coming up in our mind now. So it's really just a very kind of cognitive psychological approach in that we're trying to replace tendencies and habits that cause us to suffer and motivate us to cause suffering for others with new tendencies and new habits, new ways of framing things, new ways of, instead of thinking that because this person did 10 things to me in this life, and therefore they are intrinsically a terrible person who deserves all kinds of, terrible things, we can think of all of the millions and billions of kind things that they've done over countless previous lives. Those are both true. Both of those things are true. Conventionally speaking, they acted in these 10, unpleasant ways. It's also true that they've, over countless past lives, they've acted in beneficial ways billions of times. And which one is better to which one does it even just logically make more sense to ascribe to that person? Which one is more true? Which one should I just logically bring to mind more often? But it takes meditation. It takes repetition and reflection, and it takes starting with another kind of psychological aspect, is that Buddhism always recommends that whenever we try to change in small ways first. So we kind of leave the people who've harmed us the worst, for now, and focus more on the people that we find, irritating, and the people that are just kind of annoyances. And we try to transform our relationship with them, and then slowly work up to the more intense entanglements that we have with people. And also in terms of, the disadvantages, we can also recollect, that the Buddha made it very clear that if we leave any sentient being out of our field of love and concern, we will never achieve enlightenment. So it is our, that sentient being is giving us an opportunity to see what the limits of our loving concern is. Where is our ego asserting itself? Where are we not yet? What are we not yet able to transform? And that's really valuable feedback about our level of progress. And if we never succeed in transforming, that will continually be blocked from developing our own potential, developing our own mind. So, and there's a lot of other ways, but those are some of the sorts of techniques that we can try to use.
Thank you.
So let's say we take the word forgiveness, and so I struggle with, I've forgiven some people. I no longer, I'm angry, but I don't want to spend time with them. Is that also is that a negative?
Well, again, we also have to accept where we are and what we can do, and recognize that we're not enlightened, that we're ordinary beings, and, we have preferences, and, we're going to continue to have preferences about who we like to spend time with and who we don't want to spend time with. And the best thing to do is to just kind of hold those people, in our practice, to dedicate for them, to wish them well, to try to have as many positive thoughts as we can, thinking, even if I'm not, hanging out with them. I'm not, talking, I don't want anything bad to happen to them. I want them to achieve enlightenment. I'm going to dedicate for them to achieve enlightenment. I want them to, and then that will kind of soften the mind. That will kind of, if we can work with that, then, it's the analogy, one analogy is like rubbing butter into, hardened leather. It kind of, that it can start to make the mind more supple, and then things can shift. So it's important to hold in the mind the idea that it's not forever, that yes, maybe I feel this way now, but we also have to recognize that our mind is capable of limitlessly positive change. And so we should try to start finding ways of thinking of them as positively as we can. And like I said, doing practices for them, thinking of visualizing the Buddha, blessing them and transforming them, and just the power of that will start to change how we see them. And then the same thing too, like I said, all of the same things that happened before, even though it's a lighter version of dislike, also recollecting their good qualities, recollecting their kindness, all of those things are going to just naturally, due to the power of that repetition, will shift that dynamic over time. Because, we do want to try to cultivate a sense of closeness with all sentient beings. We want to try to cultivate a mind that spontaneously, deeply wishes to benefit sentient beings, and not a mind that's kind of like, well, I could take or leave this person, like that's not,
Yeah.
But we don't beat ourselves up about it. We just try to find techniques that are going to, just due to the power of the technique, will move the mind in the right direction, and then just keep reinforcing that.
All right. It's a little hard to take, but
Okay. So we talked about the ethical guidelines, and we talked about complete and incomplete. Now here they're what are called the 4 factors of karma. And we've kind of talked about these before. The first is that karma is definite, which means that when a karmic seed is created, it's never lost, that it will definitely bring a result. It can be purified or weakened, either positively or negatively, but barring that, under its own power, under normal circumstances, it definitely will, once the cause is created, the result will happen, barring a weakening, an intentional weakening, or barring an act that weakens, we could say, because you may unintentionally, for example, if you do something generous for someone, that's a strongly powerful positive action. But then you might think, oh, I wish I hadn't done that, because now I don't have this money to buy, this thing that I want, this new device or this new whatever, because I gave my money to this person who needed it. That kind of regret is a negative regret that's going to weaken that previous positive action. So that karma would have ripened, but now we've weakened it because we regretted a positive action. When we engage in a negative action, we do want to regret that. That will weaken the negative action, but we want to try not to regret our positive actions. And then similar refers to the idea that that there's a relationship between the energy that motivated the action and the energy and the result that brings. So the result is similar to the cause. A positive action ripens as beneficial conditions. a destructive action ripens as suffering conditions. The third is that it is individual, which means that no sentient being can experience a karmic ripening that they themselves did not create the cause to experience. That cause might have happened in a previous life, but still the mind is the same mind in this life from that life, and that continuity of mind allows for that ripening to happen over these longer timescales. But a different sentient being did not create that karma. The mind that's inhabiting or associated with this form is the same mind that was associated with perhaps a different form in a past life, and the intentional action that was engaged in that life is what is now ripening in this life. So it can happen over long time scales, but there can't be a cause that wasn't created by that quote unquote same individual. And by that we mean the mind, the mental continuum is the same. And then the last has all of these have good and problematic aspects. When it's a virtuous karma, it's quite good. When it's a non-virtuous karma, it's problematic. Karma expands over time, which means that a small positive action, if it doesn't meet with conditions that reduce its power, like regret, then it will, over time, it will grow. And the result that it can bring could be outsized compared to what initially happened. The karmic ripening can be quite strong, even though the initial karmic act might be quite small. And when this is a non-virtuous karma, this is problematic because what seems like perhaps an inconsequential intentional killing of a bug or something, given enough time and given the lack of an interfering purification force, can bring a really strong negative result. Like I said, if it's a complete karma, it may not matter whether it's a cockroach or a human being. It can at some point create the cause to experience a lower realm rebirth if it's a fully completed karma, given enough time for it to expand like that. So this is why purification practice is really important and why we should purify every day. Ideally, as I said before, in a perfect world, more than once a day, to really not allow these non-virtuous karmic seeds to grow over time, but to really kind of nip them in the bud as we're going along. And also, of course, that will keep us, just the fact that we are consistently reviewing what is constructive, what is destructive, and we're consistently trying to proactively avoid non-virtue, even for short periods. That is a habit that also will just sort of keep us on the right track, keep us moving in the right direction. So all these four characteristics apply to all karmic actions, both positive and negative. But when it's negative, problematic. When it's positive, it's quite good. Any thoughts or questions about that? I don't know what is causing. Okay. Okay, so that's sort of the overview on karma. This is now going back to the foundation of all good qualities, Lama Tsongkhapa's foundation of all good qualities, where he's saying here, seeking samsaric pleasures is the door to all suffering. And he talks about generating the strong wish for the bliss of liberation. So we've talked about the three scopes of the lamrim, and we've kind of now finished the small scope with the teachings on karma. And we're now moving into the middle scope, where we're talking about here, he's saying the wish for the bliss of liberation. And this is the idea of definite emergence, wanting to definitely emerge from suffering into a state of liberation. And it occurs on the basis of, because with the small scope, the low scope, the initial scope, however you want to think about it, the practitioner, their motivation was really just to avoid a lower realm rebirth. With the middle scope, the practitioner is now trying to is seeing even upper realm rebirths are not an end in and of themselves. They may be a means to an end, but they're not an end or a good in and of themselves. Whereas we might think, well, as long as I can get wealth and as long as I can get good food and so on. But here, Lama Tsongkhapa is encouraging us to really recognize that that chasing after sense pleasure, because it's so fleeting and because it changes into suffering when it's extended, that we need to see the shortcomings of even upper realm rebirths. And on the basis of that, not try to just think, well, all I want to do is get more of this ordinary kind of relatively okay sort of life. I really want to go for liberation from no longer participating in cyclic existence. So then, on the basis of that, on the basis of seeing the shortcomings of even the upper realm and really longing for liberation, then we really see the importance of living in a constrained, here pratimoksha vows, the individual liberation vows, the vows of, the lay vows, the vows of a monk or nun, the vows that when a person internalizes them and lives from them and really embodies them, will keep a person safe, will help us to navigate our lives in a skillful way. So we really, because we recognize that upper realm rebirths are not a good in and of themselves, but they're still a means to an end. We still need to most likely create the kinds of inner and outer conditions that can give rise to this liberation that we're seeking. We need to work cooperatively with the law of karma to do that. We need to create those inner and outer conditions by understanding the law of karma and working with it cooperatively to get the kind of result that we want, so that this goal of liberation can actually manifest. If we take rebirth in the lower realms or even the upper realms, aside from the Pure Lands, but just sort of, the desire realm gods, the form realm, the formless realm, if we take rebirth even there, doesn't really suit our purpose. So we need to navigate, we need to understand and internalize the law of karma and use it as how we navigate our lives to successfully get the results that we are hoping for and wanting. So that's the essence of the middle scope, is that idea of wishing to definitely emerge from cyclic existence by clearly apprehending that it's not, Lama Tsongkhapa says, it's not a pleasure grove. It's not some kind of blissful, enjoyable place that we should want to hang out indefinitely. It's full of dangers and disadvantages. And compared to nirvana, which is what the practitioner on the middle scope is focusing on, it's much less advantageous. Any thoughts about that?
Last night, Jeshila was, and maybe I misunderstood, but he said something to the effect that Rowena had a choice to go to a Pure Land or to it. I didn't realize that was an option. I didn't know that you can kind of like will yourself to.
Well, so I don't remember exactly the phrasing that he used. I think that there's a way of talking about people auspiciously. I mean, so there's different. Of course, he knows Rowena. He's worked with her for decades, and or at least a long time, and so he has more insight than in terms of the Pure Lands. And then, of course, when people are in the Bardo, of course, you want to have the most auspicious and most kind of beneficial way of talking and thinking and encouraging and that sort of way of addressing it. There are Pure Lands that a person can, like Amitabha's Pure Land. Every enlightened being, you could say, their environment is a Pure Land, and there are specific enlightened beings who kind of made very specific vows that their Pure Land would kind of be an option for relatively ordinary sentient beings. So not like a high-level bodhisattva necessarily, not a person who's on the cusp of full enlightenment, a relatively devoted, ordinary, good practitioner. They can engage in certain practices and develop kind of a relationship with that energy, and then at the time of their death, their mind is kind of magnetized due to the force of their practice, due to creating those causes and those conditions of practicing Abhidhamma's Pure Land and developing that familiarity. Their mind then can go there, and then there's another way of thinking about the Pure Lands. One way of thinking about them is that they're the safest place. When a person is dying, they're the safest place to go because they are. You live for a very, very long time. The conditions are incredibly beneficial and conducive, and like there's an enlightened being there, and so. But then they also say that it can take much longer to actually achieve enlightenment in terms of absolute terms, as compared to taking rebirth in the human realm again, where through Vajrayana, a person can achieve enlightenment even in one human lifetime. So what they say is that taking a human rebirth, if a person does like have a choice, or even in terms of what a person aspires to or makes prayers or aspirations or kind of how they're thinking about that, that it is safer to go to a pure land, but it's more, in a way, it can be more courageous or braver to not make those kinds of aspirations and instead. So, but that's, there's no, it could be that, not, that for a particular person, one way really is the best, and that really is, the way that they should go. For another person, maybe a different thing. So it's not like one size fits all, but just that, of course, like the great masters and so on that you read about in history, they said, may, let me be reborn in hell so that I can work for the benefit, the benefit. So that, that, and that's, but, to really genuinely want that is so far beyond what almost anyone is capable of, to genuinely have that be one's motivation. And then, of course, what they say is that all of the great masters who wished that actually achieved enlightenment when they died, so they didn't get to do. And then, of course, maybe they could emanate, they could send emanations into the hell realms. But they weren't actually, they didn't actually get what they wanted. They got the opposite of what they were saying, because of how virtuous and how pure that karma is. But yes, it is true that there are practices that exist where any practitioner can kind of, and that doesn't mean that you automatically succeed. It doesn't mean that just because you recite a sadhana, just because then like everyone who does that when they die, they will go to Amitabha's Pure Land. It certainly doesn't mean that, but you can it is possible to create the causes and conditions for that to happen. It is something that we can cultivate.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we will, like I said, I'll have to record another class. And we can talk about that maybe next week, because we're now going to move into the great scope, which is characterized by bodhicitta. And this is on the middle scope, where the practitioner develops that definite emergence, that wish to be free of cyclic existence. That refers to their own suffering. And then, as I said in maybe the first class or second class, that practitioner is meant to mature into the great scope, where they realize that just wanting liberation for oneself is not sufficient, because all other sentient beings are suffering. So here, this is what it's saying, that we're all in the same boat. We've all fallen into the sea of samsara. And here, mother migratory beings literally means that all other sentient beings have played the role of a mother for us countless times in past lives. That's what I was talking about before, about, seeing the beneficial parts of a person, seeing the good in people. So it's like all other sentient beings, they're not just strangers, they're not just random sentient beings. They've been my own mother countless times in previous lives. And in a way, it's like seeing your own mother in this life drowning right in front of you. Of course you would do something. Of course you would take on the responsibility of trying to do something about that. So yeah, that's what we principally, that and the nature of reality for a Mahayana practitioner. The nature of reality is also what we focus on more so in the great scope. But we join that with bodhicitta motivation, the wish to achieve. Bodhicitta is the wish, the aspiration to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of all mother sentient beings. wanting to free all sentient beings from suffering, not just being satisfied with wanting to be free from suffering for oneself, really wanting to extend that, recognizing that there's no difference between oneself and others. And so I need to work for the benefit of all and not just oneself, not just my own happiness, my own liberation. That's what a person trains in on the Great Scope. And in the recording that I'll do, there's two specific meditations that are done that actually cultivate bodhicitta, or result in bodhicitta actually dawning in the mind. Any questions, thoughts, questions? We can go a little bit longer.
I'll just volunteer a technique that I use that I find more effective for me, given my background, rather than imagining that everyone else has been my mother. I get the sense that I have been the mother of everyone. And particularly if I've got someone who's distressing me, I imagine what they were like as a baby and how would I feel toward them. And I would feel love, compassion, just wanting to hold and protect them. And I find that shifts my energy much more effectively, or just flat out effectively. So that's something that I've found very helpful. That, and also when I see somebody behaving in a manner that I don't approve of, I sort of go back and think, this is a very distressed person. Something bad has happened to them in the past. This is what's causing this behavior. This is not, they are, in fact, they do have Buddha nature. And I've got to go back to that. There is a divine essence in there. I'm missing it at the moment because it's covered with whatever. Yeah. Those are my techniques I use.
Yep. Great.
I like that.
All right. So we will, and Meditation 101 starts next week. And like I said, we can spend some time after talking about, and maybe on email or other things, we can talk about the material that we've not been able to cover. I've only ever done this as a 5-week class. Doing it as a 4-week class is really challenging. So let's just dedicate then. So we recollect our virtuous motivation. And we think that we've actualized that motivation by thinking about these topics. And that contemplating these topics in that way has created positive energy in the mind. The process of finding tools and techniques to be of greater benefit to others naturally creates positive energy in the mind. And we offer that energy for the benefit of sentient beings. We can dedicate for Rowena, thinking that may she find the most auspicious, most beneficial kind of rebirth where she's able to make the most rapid progress. And dedicate for all of the beings in the intermediate state, all of the beings of the desire realm, form realm, the formless realm. May they all have conducive conditions. May they all quickly perfect their minds. May they all quickly be completely free of suffering. And may I too perfect my mind so that I have the ability to work in an unmistaken way for the benefit of sentient beings. All right. Well, thanks for coming.